with grassroots movements. My name is Lauren Beelor, and I am the Democracy Director for SIX, where I help to lead our Democracy Champions cohort, which is a national initiative to support state legislators across the country who are stepping up to champion reforms for an equitable, inclusive, and participatory democracy, and will be moderating this call. As of recent, we have been witnessing a national onslaught of attempts to strip people's freedom to vote, with a laser focus on stripping people of color's right to vote. Conservative state lawmakers are relying on their majority in legislatures to enact new barriers to voting. However, the ongoing amplification from champion legislators and the rising voices of corporate leadership are helping to move the needle on mitigating the impact of these bills. We are so delighted today to be joined by four dynamic legislators who are representing four very important states working to fight back to protect people's freedom to vote. Today, we are joined by Georgia Representative Erica Thomas, Arizona Representative Athena Salmon, Michigan Representative Darren Camilleri, and North Carolina Representative Allison Dahl. We will hear from each legislator as they describe the political motivations behind these attacks, strategies for stopping these repressive efforts, and share details of the potential impact the legislation would have. As a quick note of housekeeping, we will begin with hearing from each representative individually and then open up for questions from journalists. If you have a question that you would like to ask, please indicate it in the chat, noting who the question is for. We will then call on you during the Q&A portion, and you can unmute yourself to proceed with the question. Additionally, we will have live transcript enabled for this meeting. Please press the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen to see auto-generated subtitles. And now I will turn it over to our first panelist, Georgia Representative Erica Thomas.
Thank you so much, Lauren, and thank you so much, SIX, for organizing this with the legislators that we are on today. We are now seeing a direct attack on our voting rights in Georgia and all across the country. There are so many different things that Republicans are doing to stop Black and brown voters from voting. In 2016, in Georgia, the presidential election, there were 2.4 million voters that came out to vote. In 2020, there was an alarming over 4 million voters that came out to vote. That is up 66%. As you can see by these numbers, you would think that we should be celebrating. We should be providing voters with more resources to get out and vote all over Georgia. But instead of celebrating, we are trying to defeat bills that are popping up, trying to stop people from voting. A bill just like SB 202 that was not only passed in the House and the Senate, and in the same day signed into law by Governor Kemp. This is an egregious bill because it has so many different things that attack us as voters, like a state takeover, taking over the constitutional rights that the constitutional officer, the Secretary of State, has to be over the Board of Elections, and giving it to the state legislator, which is Republican centered. Also, making a misdemeanor to pass out water or snacks to voters that are in line over 7 to 8 hours. And another thing, getting rid of mobile voting. In Metro Atlanta, we had 2 mobile recreational vehicles. And from those 2 vehicles, 11,200 people voted. We are no longer going to be able to have mobile voting. All of these things and much more are in SB 202, and we are trying our best now because the bill is already signed into law. We are now going to fight it in court. But we need the people of America to urge your Congress and senators to pass H.R. 1 and H.R. 4, the Voting Rights Act. If these 2 bills that are now in the Senate can be passed, it will help the fight for us in Georgia and all across the country to denounce these bad voter suppression bills. The fight is still on in the US Congress. So we also are urging a lot of these businesses to come out and fight with us. Now, we do see that there are some businesses that are coming out, but of course, the bill is already signed into law, and it's just a little bit too late. But we don't discourage these companies for coming out all over the country, where you are seeing in over 43 states these voter suppression bills popping up everywhere. So we encourage businesses and the people to stand up to help us fight these egregious bills. I am going to now pass the mic to one of our other fellow state representatives in Michigan, our Representative Darren Camarelli.
Thank you, Rep. Thomas. I really appreciate it. And thank you for all the fight that you're putting up in Georgia. We know that it is tough right now, and just keep up the fight for all people who are looking to vote and just access their rights. We know that in Michigan, we were ground zero for the big lie. Michigan was the place where Republicans across our state fomented this lie that our elections are not secure. Because we saw in 2018 a voter initiated constitutional change to expand the right to vote in Michigan, voters took advantage of that. Voters from every political ideology, Republicans, Democrats, and independents, went to the polls in Michigan at a record rate. And because our voices were heard, we saw real change in Michigan, where we elected Joe Biden as our next president. And Michigan was one of those decisive places where that happened. But because Republicans were so upset at the results, they fomented lie after lie to try to discredit the votes that took place in our state and try to discredit our elections, which laid the foundation for these attacks that are happening across the country. We saw in my oversight committee last session where they brought Rudy Giuliani, as well as a host of people who have no expertise in elections whatsoever, come to our committee to sow doubt, and created an environment where they were literally just lying in our state government committees about what happened in our elections. And they used those lies to create the situation where they're introducing bill after bill to try to suppress the vote. It happened in Michigan in December. We saw what they were attempting to do to discredit our ballots. And now we see in the Michigan legislature, the Republican Senate has put forth over 39 bills that they are attempting to pass to suppress the vote here in our state. We know that this is going to be the fight of our generation, where Michiganders and Americans across the country have to again fight for our right to vote. And that's why we need HR 1 to pass, so that these attacks at state legislatures cannot happen anymore. Here specifically in Michigan, those 39 bills would limit absentee ballot access. They would limit ballot box drop boxes across our state. They would make it harder for people to request an absentee ballot and make it illegal to send out a voter application just to attempt to make it easier for people to access the ballot box. There are so many other components to the 39 bill package that would suppress our rights here in our state. And here's the thing, even though people think that we are protected because we have a Democratic governor, because she will veto those bad bills. She has already made that guarantee. But in Michigan, we have a unique system where voters can actually go around it. So we have what's called an initiative petition. And so Republicans have already promised that when she vetoes these bills, they will collect the hundreds of thousands of signatures that they need, take it to the legislature, and the legislature, which is Republican held in both the House and the Senate, can adopt any proposal that they want if those signatures are valid without the governor's signature. It is a unique component in our state legislature that we've seen used before, where they've attacked workers, they've attacked paid sick leave, and they're looking to do it again with our democracy. So we need to be on alert to make sure that we are monitoring what is happening with this fight, because even though the governor can and will veto any bad bill around our elections, there is a way for Republicans to go around it. And so we need to make sure that all of our friends across the state of Michigan and across the country are paying attention to this, because there is a chance that voter rights in Michigan can be further suppressed. Even after, again, we expanded the right to vote by a constitutional ballot measure in 2018, voters are on our side. Democracy should not be a partisan idea. Democracy is something that we have all agreed to as our system of government, and we should make sure that everybody has a chance to access that right, access the ballot, and remove any restrictions that make it harder for us to vote. I look forward to joining my colleagues in state legislatures across the country in this fight as we try to protect democracy here in our country. I will now be turning it over to Representative Athena Salman from Arizona to talk more about what's going on in her state.
Thank you so much for having me this morning and for the introduction. As was mentioned, I'm Athena Salman, State Representative, Ranking Member on the House Government and Elections Committee. And I think it's so fitting that the representative from Michigan is handing it over to the representative from Arizona, because the same auditing firm that the representative alluded to that tried to undermine the will of Michigan voters is now the head firm that has been hired by the Arizona Senate Republicans to try and overthrow the will of the 3.4 million voters in Arizona who voted in the 2020 election and ultimately decided that Joe Biden, not Donald Trump, Joe Biden would be our president. And so this firm, Cyber Ninjas, that worked to overthrow the election results in Michigan is now the lead firm headed up by the Senate Republicans here in Arizona to still try to overthrow the 2020 elections 4 months into 2021. But this is the level of corruption. This is the level of threats and attacks on our democracy that we are facing at the state level, both on the legislative end. According to the Brennan Center, Arizona is the top state in the country that is experiencing the number of measures being proposed to attack and diminish your right to vote. Many of these proposals, the most extreme of which grants the legislature, not the voters, the authority to pick our leaders, but the ones that are inching their way forward to the governor's desk are ones that purge voters from the early vote list and ends the permanence of our early vote list, that add onerous requirements to vote by mail, and that allow third parties more power to challenge the voter registration status of voters who have a right to vote and who are registered to vote in the state of Arizona. That's all happening legislatively. And, you know, I'm coming from a state where after a decade of long, hard work of grassroots organizing in our community to lay the foundation where we are now a state that not only has one, but we have two United States senators. I wish I was here before you saying that I could be loud and proud about that. But unfortunately, it is no secret that the senior senator from Arizona is one of the largest roadblocks who is actively protecting Jim Crow era policies such as the filibuster, which is being used to stop the passage of HR 1 and HR 4 to prevent new Jim Crow laws that are being enacted and being moved forward in states like Arizona, in states like Georgia, in states like Michigan. And we're going to hear from the representative from North Carolina up next. Our senator has the power. She is one of two senators who has the power to unilaterally impact and protect the right to vote, our freedom to vote, not only for the millions of Arizonans, but for the over 300 million Americans who are counting on our US Senate to act on HR 1 and HR 4. So it's with the utmost urgency, and I really thank my colleagues from across the country to convene on this press call, because ultimately it feels like in a state like Arizona, where the Republicans have a very slim majority, by no means do these Republicans have a mandate. Each chamber in the legislature, they only have a 1-member majority. That's it. And yet here we find them ourselves where they are still governing from the most extremist policies that ultimately will take a record voter turnout year that Arizona's ever seen, the highest voter turnout in 2020, and they're working very hard to make sure that that turnout never happens again. So I add my voice to the numerous voices in expressing the urgency that Congress and the US Senate act to pass HR 1 for the People Act, to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, so that in states like Arizona, my freedom and the freedom of my constituents' right to vote is protected for future generations. And I'd love to turn it over now to Representative Alice Dale from North Carolina. Representative, I'm so sorry if I said your last name wrong, but the floor is yours.
It's okay. Just for the record, it is Allison Dahl. It's a hard one to pronounce because, you know, it's just what happens. So in North Carolina, we're working really hard to make sure that voting is accessible to everyone, regardless of where they live, how often they work, and their mobility level. North Carolina is seeing bills filed that will require voted absentee ballots to be delivered by election day. We also regularly have to fight to keep plenty of early voting sites open and in most accessible parts of the counties. NC also has a gerrymandering problem where representatives are the ones drawing themselves into their districts. And I feel strongly that people should choose their representatives and not vice versa. The other thing is, just recently, the North Carolina Republicans used the legislative committees to interrogate our state board of elections director, even though there was no indication of wrongdoing or election irregularity in North Carolina. And the Republicans actually had a great successful cycle. So I'm not sure where we're coming from. And the impact on who votes, you know, we had 80, in some spots, we had an 85% voting this past time, and, or a 75, excuse me, 75. I was just talking to somebody yesterday who really wants to see that, especially in Wake County, go up to 85%. And we're very hopeful because we have to get folks out to vote. So, and North Carolina's economy runs on working people and is home to some of the best universities in the country. And many of them choose vote early because it's quick and easy. And having plenty of accessible early voting sites keeps lines down on election day and making it easier for everyone to vote. I know in the county, or the part of the county that I represent in North Carolina, we fought for 2 to 3 years, if not longer, to get a site on the campus, just so it was easier for folks to vote. So the General Assembly has been in session and will be in session probably for most of this year, even though we're a part-time legislature. My guess is that we might have a month or two break. So the deadline for the Senate for filing bills has passed, but the deadline for the House is now, I think it's 2 or 3 weeks away. So we're going to see the election bills. We've only had one election bill filed. So we're going to still have to watch really closely. I want folks to keep an eye on what's happening in the state legislature. Make sure you let representatives know what you see and hear that happens in North Carolina, and make sure that you are protecting your right to vote. And that may be, for my 89-year-old mother, that may be an absentee ballot. And, you know, during COVID, we changed the absentee ballot laws for 1 signature as opposed to 2. And a lot of people found, but we added an address requirement. So you had to have an address so that during the cure process, people could check. So I really want us to watch all of these states, specifically, and Georgia. I'm not going to pick one out, and make sure that we're keeping avenues open for people to vote, because without our vote, we don't have a voice, and we need to make sure we always have a voice in our government. Sorry about the noise, guys. I'm on the side of the road, but I'm going to pass it over to Lauren again. And thank you so much for this time and this opportunity to speak to you. And I'm glad everybody showed up for such an important subject.
Thank you, Rep. Dahl, and thank you again to each of our panelists for addressing the state-by-state impacts of the voting rights attacks happening across the country. As highlighted by each of these amazing representatives, the recent anti-voter coordinated efforts are a clear response to the record voter turnout and, in some cases, expansive reform that took place in 2020. And these efforts are definitely not the first and certainly won't be the last. So thank you for highlighting the importance of HR 1 and HR 4 and how it will help to preserve democracy and move the work that you're doing forward in state legislatures. We will now turn it over to our Q&A portion. Our first question is from Christina Cassidy at the Associated Press. Christina's question, and I'll go ahead and take this one for Christina. Could you please talk about any efforts to restrict the use of drop boxes in your state? What impact will this have on voters in future elections if passed? And what do you make of security concerns used to justify these actions? I'm gonna turn it over to Rep. Camilleri first, since you have to hop off earlier.
Thank you. I mean, look, the fear is that every time they restrict the right to vote, it disenfranchises more voters and also creates a space where voters won't want to participate in our elections. And so it only furthers anti-democratic thought and anti-democratic views, so that the reaction is, look, we saw record voter turnout this last election across the country. And because our voices were heard in those moments, we saw a reaction to that. Now, I hope that it has the opposite effect. I hope that it galvanizes voters across the country. It shows us that our rights are under attack and we need to fight back by casting those ballots and electing people who agree that democracy is a fundamental idea that we are all on the same page with. But it is something that we just have to be cautious of, because we know that every time they make it harder for somebody to vote, for example, by enacting further and more restrictive voter ID laws or making it harder to use an absentee ballot, it just discourages people from participating in our process, particularly people of color, young folks, and folks who don't have access to means and to resources and to education and wealth. And those are the types of voters that we know we need to prioritize, because they're the ones who are impacted the most by policies that are passed at the state level as well. And so anytime that we restrict that right to vote, we're making our policies, not only just with electoral reform, we're making our policies that we enact in state legislative levels put forth by Republicans, those priorities are not reflective of the electorate as a whole. And so we want to make sure that we're making it easier, not harder.
Lauren, I'd like to add to that, if you don't mind. So here in Metro Atlanta, drop boxes were very successful. People forget that last time we were in a pandemic, this time we're still in a pandemic. So we still need our drop boxes. In Metro Atlanta, for example, we had 94 drop boxes. And with SB 202, that would cut it down to only 23 drop boxes. So you can just imagine, and not just cutting the number of drop boxes down, but putting it inside of a building and only during business hours. So usually what would happen is that you would be able to, after you get off work, you'd be able to pull up to the drop box that's outside in your neighborhood, put your absentee ballot in at your leisure. But now they have seen how successful it is for us to be able to vote, and they have cut down the ballot boxes. And it's crazy that it happened, because as you can see, Governor Kemp voted by a ballot drop box. So they loved ballot drop boxes until Trump and the Republicans started losing.
Thank you, Rep. Thomas and Rep. Camilleri. I will go on to the next question, and there's a question in the chat, or a request for a question in the chat from Walt Sorg. Walt, I will turn it over to you to unmute.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Question for the field. The chances for passing HR 1 appear pretty much to rest with Senators Sinema and Manchin, since the Republicans have made it clear they're not going to support it. What will you do to try to make that happen?
I'm happy to start with that question, given one of the senators you mentioned is from the state of Arizona. So we have been very vocal in the state. Our local community organizations, elected leaders who are on the front lines at the state level, who have been fighting against these attempts by the Republicans to pick and choose their voters and make it harder for Americans to vote. And so we have been continuously pressuring the senator, and we have no plans to let up on that pressure, be it doing actions in front of her office. We have constituents setting up meetings with her office to try to persuade her. There's been op-eds, letter to the editors by her constituents, the local journalists here, and several editorial boards and columnists have pointed out and flagged that the senator's decision to stick by a procedural rule versus taking meaningful action to improve the lives of hundreds of millions of Americans, including millions of Arizonans, is not a popular position. And so consistently reminding her of that, because it is no secret to people all across the country, not just Democrats. The senators, when in the future, not only rest on whether or not the diverse community-wide turnout of the Democratic base that she has turns out and actually votes for her and feels inspired by the work that she's done. But it's also contingent upon her favorability rating with independent voters, which we've also seen starting to plummet here in Arizona. So the fact of the matter, and what we have been very much articulating to the senator, is whether or not the senator believes or thinks that she will be competitive in a few years. If the Republicans are successful in a state like Arizona, where they're able to next year alone kick off 143,000 Arizonans from the early vote list, if they are successful at erecting these barriers so that the hundreds of thousands of Arizonans that are left on the early vote list can even cast a ballot, given that the requirements are so restrictive. These barriers are being enacted and being put in place because the Republicans are making the gamble that the people that it's going to hurt more are people of color, are young people, are people experiencing poverty who skew and lean more towards demographic. In fact, let me remind everyone, it is the lawyer for the Arizona Republican Party who argued to the Supreme Court that the reason that they put these barriers, these arbitrary barriers that are designed to make it harder for people to vote, is because they know it gives them a competitive advantage over the Democrats. So we will not let up on the pressure. And the more that the senator, at least the senator in Arizona, doubles down and digs her heel in, it also emboldens us to let the people of Arizona know that she is standing with the Jim Crow filibuster instead of standing with protecting our freedom to vote, instead of standing with pandemic relief, instead of standing with, we have draconian fetal personhood bills that are on the cusp of making it to the governor's desk. Instead of standing with the American people, she is standing with the Jim Crow relic. And we are going to be louder and louder every day she blocks progress for Arizonans and for Americans.
Thank you so much, Rep. Salmon. Rep. Dahl, did you want to chime in on that question as well?
No. I think she said exactly what everybody is planning on doing and said it quite eloquently, but thank you so much for asking.
Great, thank you. And this is just a last call for any additional questions in the chat. All right, seeing none. Any last remarks from any of the representatives?
I just want to say one thing, that, you know, voting is both Democrats and Republicans and independents. And this, we need to figure a way, and I work towards this every day of my life, is to make voting important to everyone, because squelching a voice of anyone is not helping us get to a better democracy. I have been very happy and pleasantly surprised listening to different podcasts that my fellow Republicans are on, and we have a lot of the same concerns. So I really want us to, not only do I want to see us block all of this and stop all of this, but I'd like to see us start to work together and start to mend. I mean, there are things that we'll never be able to work together on, but voting helps everybody, not just one section, because democracy is so incredibly important. You know, I have to say, as a child, I was much more excited about voting than I was getting my driver's license, because that was my voice and I could make that count. So I just want us to keep, I know we are going to keep working, but this is for all the people that are not being interviewed to understand that it's going to take everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Rep. Dahl. And we actually have an additional question that came in from Roxy from Ms. Magazine. And the question is as follows: what have you found are the most salient talking points and or arguments to sound these alarms and get people to pay attention and understand?
In Arizona, the people are paying attention. I think that's one of the virtues of being a solidly battleground purple state is people of all different backgrounds, of all party affiliations, are paying close watch to what the legislature is doing, to what Congress is doing or lack thereof, and it really just depends on the issue. And it depends on the piece of legislation. You know, when it comes to the Pebble Purge, we really focus on not only the number of Arizonans who are at risk of being purged from the voter list, but we also highlight the racial impacts. When it comes to the sham audit that Senate President Karen Fann is conducting, we've had conversations directly with voters about how their politicians want to get their hands on their secret ballots. And rightfully so, the voters of Maricopa County, which the audit's targeted at, are outraged and very dismayed and have expressed their discontention both with the Senate and with the Board of Supervisors. So it depends more specifically on what type of attack and infringement on our freedom to vote that the Republicans are launching, since in Arizona we are again facing the legislative attacks, but then there's these, you know, you have the audit, you have the Attorney General who's gone after and tried to prosecute voters using some of these criminalization laws that the Republicans have passed in previous legislative sessions. So that whole playbook of how they were able to stop people of color and voters that the Republicans don't consider quality from voting in the past, they're launching a entire holistic campaign. I feel funny saying holistic, but a very comprehensive campaign legislatively and then outside the legislature to intimidate and deter voter participation in the future. And so we very much go and articulate that to the voters and make sure that they understand their rights and make sure that they understand what's going on, in hopes that they'll still have a freedom to vote in the future election cycles. But the best way to guarantee that is by Congress passing HR 1 and HR 4. Otherwise, it's a gamble state by state.
And Rep. Dahl, I saw that you had the hand raised. Just wanted to turn it to you.
Well, and I think that one of the things out there is that the big lie that, you know, folks are trying to steal votes. I heard one time that Democrats sit around in a living room and fill out ballots, and I've never seen that. And I've been in a politically active family for a long time in my life, so not sure where that comes from. But we have to help people understand that, voter fraud is such a low percentage. I think it's somewhere between 2 and 3%, maybe. I don't know the exact statistic, or I can't recall it right at this moment, but voter fraud is just not, it's just not happening. And we have to continue to push that point out, that voting is safe, that voting is a right and a responsibility, that voting is important so your voice is heard. And I think that specifically, and Ms. Magazine is a great voice for women. And I think women need to understand that not only are Black and brown votes being squelched, but women's votes are being squelched. We had a situation here in North Carolina where they were showing somebody how to use an electronic machine and taking both the wife and the husband to show them, and then saying to the wife, okay, you can go ahead and show us how you're going to vote, so that husband was there to watch it. And those folks got stopped. But, having somebody go in the voting booth with you does not make it so that it's a safe voting for you to vote your conscience. So I think that we have to go back to the beginning of, everybody needs their voice, and everybody needs a safe, quiet, private voice in the voting booth, and start it at 0. I just, I can't, when I think about the fact that my grandmother voted and only voted with my grandfather, and the time changed that, my mother never voted with my father and always voted her own private ballot. And so we have to keep that progression moving and not regression. All right, thanks.
Thank you, Rep. Dahl. And Rep. Thomas, turning it over to you to close us out on this question.
Well, I think the biggest talking point for us here in Georgia is they are looking for a solution to a problem that's not there. And I think that's the biggest thing. The problem is never people coming out and voting and voter integrity. And so it's never about, for them, I believe that it is not about getting rid of fraudulent votes. It's about getting rid of Democratic votes.
Thank you, Rep. Thomas, and thank you to each representative that participated with this press call. Also, thank you to each and every member of the press who joined this call today as well. We are coming to a close and see no further questions. So again, thank you to each. As Katie noted, you can email Katie at stateinnovation.org if you have any additional questions on any of the bills mentioned from these states. And again, thank you so much for joining.